I'm on here to introduce Jim Fisher, who is a professor emeritus at Fordham. He taught also, besides Fordham, at St. Louis University, St. Peter's, and don't tell anybody but Yale, okay? And he's the author of things like Catholic Counterculture in America, the Communion of Immigrants, his biography of Dr. Tom Dooley, which is really something else, and On the Irish Waterfront, plus a number of edited books and articles. And I've known Jim for about 45 years. Yeah, yeah. And of course, his wife, lovely wife, Christina, and their wonderful son, Charlie, Charlie, as long as he's been around. We'll talk about Charlie a little bit later on. Jim and I wrote our dissertations essentially together, back to back, exactly, at the computer room, Van Dyke Hall at Rutgers, and on 8.5-inch floppy disks. Yeah, they did. And listening to Joe Franklin on the radio, we were also roommates for a while, and it's hard to say it's a room because it was a warehouse that we lived in, and it was quite an experience with our landlord Fifi and his wife Susan, right? Fifi, the French artist with the orange hair, Jim also had a hand in my own conversion. I started out as a Methodist and became Catholic while I was at Rutgers, and Jim had a hand in that. I was doing a lot of research in Italy that affected me, but knowing Jim affected me as well. And he ended up, because my godfather, there was the ceremony, the confirmation, my godfather was my original godfather, who also became Catholic. Uncle Charlie. He was a jockey along with my father, and but he couldn't make it. He couldn't make it to the thing, and so Jim was the proxy. So Jim's kind of like my godfather as well. So I consider myself one of Jim's miracles. But enough about me. As much as I hate talking about myself, maybe Jim can pick up a few miracles this afternoon. Okay. So Jim Fisher, there you go.
Oh, thank you so much. Wow. It's just amazing the just the human connections, especially through Jesuit places, but I'll get to that now, but in a minute. But I have a Methodist grandfather from Scranton, and he became a Catholic. No claim on that. That was in 1904, and he became a Catholic and married my grandmother. But anyway, it's so good to be here. One thing about Roy, all the things he said are true. But real quick, I just have to say, so my sister Janet, who's my younger sister, she called my mother one night around 1992, and she said, "Mom, I'm getting married." And she was marrying a guy named Michael Feely, who is an attorney in Los Angeles. And my sister Janet said, "And Mom, not only that," and sometimes my sister and mother, sometimes they're in different wavelengths, and my sister was so excited to tell my mother, because she thought it was the greatest thing ever. My mother would be so ecstatic. She said, "Not only are we getting married, we're getting married in Rome, in the Vatican." And my mother said, "Really?" She said, "Janet, I think you're going to get married in New Jersey, like everybody else in the history of your family has ever gotten married." And so there was an impasse there until Professor Roy Domenico promised my family, particularly my mom, that he would be like their official chaperone and guide. Because my mother was like, "I've got to have CNN. I've got to have English language TV. In other words, my mother was not impressed at all by the cultural, religious, Vatican angles whatsoever. But Roy totally took care of her and my family. It was the greatest experience ever of my life. It was really probably the greatest experience of my life. This is 1993 in the summer. And then he took me down to Sicily to a conference, a history conference. Just absolutely incredible. Anybody remember the famous flamenco dancer, Jose Greco? He used to be on the Ed Sullivan Show all the time. This is a generational thing. There was a famous dancer. He was at the conference with his wife, who was an American academic. What a time. So I really owe enormous. Roy was a fabulous host in Italy. Anybody ever have a chance, students, if you ever have a chance to go to Italy, anybody, it will change your life. So thanks again. To say what a pleasure it is to be here with Tim Dawley and Dan Kosaki, both former students and colleagues from Fordham, and what they mean to you is just incredible. It's really just a wonderful feeling, I mean, I haven't been at a Jesuit place now. I retired early from my job. I'll probably get into that by the end today, but I left in 2018. And I live in Northern California, and I just haven't been in a Jesuit environment in all those years since. And so it's just been a joy to be here today. And I am going to talk about now my understanding, my appreciation of the Ignatian experience as a historian, not as a theologian, which I'm not, and I don't really know anything about theology, as a historian, and including as a historian of the New York Jesuits, which has become one of my vocations or one of my angles. So on September 12th, 2001, I drove to St. Peter's College campus in Jersey City, and I was intending, and I did attend, a mass that was being celebrated by this Jesuit, Raymond Schroth, who known to everybody as Ray, who was a Jesuit who had been at Fordham, he'd been at many places, Holy Cross, lots of Jesuit schools, and he was my office neighbor at St. Peter's College in the fall of 2001. And I'll get into that a little bit later, how I ended up there, but just for that one semester. But on September 12th, 2001, Ray celebrated the Mass in a little classroom in the basement of a building in St. Peter's College. And then he said, and I don't remember anything at all about the Mass, and then he said, the only thing I remember is he said, now there are buses lined up on Montgomery Street in Jersey City, and you're all gonna go on these buses, you're gonna board these buses, and they're gonna take you down to Exchange Place on the Jersey City waterfront. And as far as I can recall, that's about what he said. Well, what was I going to do? I followed his directions. And I wound up within a few moments, I was at the Jersey City Waterfront Exchange Place. And then within seconds, I had been invited to board a boat of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Why? Because on that morning, the only way you could possibly access the site of the World Trade Center was by boat crossing the Hudson River from Jersey City or other places on the Jersey side. And that's indeed what we did. And then it seemed to me literally no time had passed, it felt. By the time that I got on this boat, and the next thing you know, I found myself with hundreds of others. We got off the boats in this North Cove Marina this is what was known as the Winter Garden Theater. Of course, there was the site of the World Trade Center, and this is pretty much exactly how it looked at that moment. It was still on fire when we got to the Trade Center. And what they did, of course, is they had us deliver supplies to the rescue workers, like a bucket brigade. And so what we did is we all formed this line. And again, I had no idea what I was doing, or even barely where I was. They had us form a line from here all the way through that little sort of alley there, right almost to the point. I mean, I was standing between those still standing buildings, and I mean, it was still on fire, And so the overwhelming impact, it was impossible for somebody like me to process, so I didn't. I had I don't remember any real reaction to that day, what was happening. You know what I mean? It's almost like if you didn't want to stop and think what it actually meant, what was happening right in front of us. And so anyway, I did what I was told. And then at the end of the day, they put us back on the boats, and we went back, and I climbed up the hill in Jersey City. And as I was heading towards the campus where my car was parked, a Jersey City cop said to me, "Look at you." I said, "What about me?" He said, "Where have you been?" And before I could even say where I'd been, I suddenly realized what he was doing. He was looking, my legs, my trousers, I was completely covered in ashes and soot up to here. And it finally began to dawn on me, like I was at the site of the disaster of the World Trade Center. How many people died? Were an enormous, as the mayor at the time said, it was too much to bear. Like the death toll is too much to bear. You couldn't even begin to think about that in terms of the number of human beings who've been killed. And so it was at that moment that it kind of kicked into me what actually had happened and what I witnessed. And of course, my next move, my next real conscious move was something that I was aware of every day, and that is I wanted to go home and see my son. Because my son, Charlie, was diagnosed with autism in 1998, and we had decided, my wife, Christina Chu, and I had decided, along on the behalf of Charlie, we decided we were going to drop everything and move to New Jersey, where I was from, because New Jersey is famed for its autism schools, and my son was very severely affected with autism. So we dropped everything, we moved, and the reason we were able to move was because even though I had a 10-year job, I was perfectly willing to give up, and I did, at another Jesuit school in St. Louis. Somebody had made a call to the president of St. Peter's College, and I know who that is now. Somebody at another Jesuit college at Holy Cross had called the president of St. Peter's College and said, you got to give this guy a job for at least a semester so we can get his family reestablished in Jersey. And that's what he did. And his name was David O'Brien, was the historian that made it possible for you to, through the president of St. Peter's, a guy named, a wonderful man, the late father, Jim Loughran. And so anyway, it was Ray Schroth who kind of set this whole thing in motion. And I can't say enough about Ray, and I'll say a couple of things as we go about him, because Ray was not only a great Jesuit, he was a great Jesuit journalist and writer. And that was very important to me because as it happens, it just so happens coincidentally, I was at St. Peter's College because I needed a job, and they got me a job there. But the incredible coincidence of it before 9/11 was I was busy writing a book about the Port of New York in New Jersey and about the Jersey City waterfront and about a movie called On the Waterfront that had been filmed in Hoboken in the adjoining town to Jersey City, starring, of course, the great Marlon Brando, a great movie that won 8 Academy Awards. And I wrote this book and got very, very lucky. But at that point, it was the last thing in my mind of that day. But what happened is, in the days and weeks that followed, I began to understand things about the history of the New York waterfront, particularly the Jesuit relationship and the Jesuit presence in the New York waterfront, and what that meant to my work that I did, into my life and my understanding of things. Because Ray, it turns out, this is September 12th, the day that he said the Mass. September 11th, 24 hours earlier, when this first happened, I was in a classroom. Well, actually, before I was in a classroom, I drove to St. Peter's College on Route 78 from Central Jersey, where we were living. I had a beat-up old car with no radio, and I saw this steam, what looked like steam or smoke coming out of the North Tower, and I had no idea what that was. And as I pulled up to the campus in Jersey City, a man whose name I can't recall, but I knew he worked for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. As I got out of the car, I parked the car, I said, "What happened?" He said, "I don't know." But he said, "I have a lot of friends in that building." He said, "I have a lot of friends in there." And that's all I knew at that point, that something terrible had happened to one of the Twin Towers. And then I walked in to teach a class 20, 30 minutes later, a student named Vincent Rohn from Bayonne, New Jersey, who up at that point, all I knew about Bayonne and Jersey City, they had a rivalry. You know what I mean? They always made fun of it. You know, are you from Hudson County? Where are you from? Oh, me too. I'm from Cranford. Yeah, we'll talk. Oh, very good. Yeah, we'll talk. So very good. So we said a prayer. He said, after he said, "I just saw the North Tower collapse." You know, it was impossible to make sense of it. You know, and so then we dismissed the class, and of course, the college immediately. I have no idea how they were able to do this under Father Loughran and Ray and others. It was the Jesuits who kind of just immediately sensed what was needed to do. And what was needed was for the people to take care of each other, to watch out for each other, to assure each other they were going to be okay. And they had the first Mass was the day of the 9/11. And Ray Schroth said, at the college, now remember, this is the day before the one I attended, Father James Loughran, St. Peter's president, challenges an auditorium packed with students and faculty to make this tragedy a moment of grace to which they must respond with overtures of peace. And he predicts that within the next days, they will see an outpouring of generosity and sacrifice as New York and its neighbor, Jersey City, respond to the crisis. Distributing communion, saying, "The body of Christ, as I place the host in each extended hand." This is Ray writing now. He says, "I say to myself, this is reason enough to have Catholic colleges and universities to teach the young how to mourn together in crisis and reach out to a world suffering more than themselves." Now, he wrote this immediately that same day. He wrote this later that same day. It was published, I believe, the next day in the National Catholic Reporter newspaper. And then Ray then wrote, toward the end, I start running low on hosts and break them into little pieces, saying, "The body of Christ," and to myself, yes, the body of Christ broken. Christ's body broken in the men and women who jumped from the top floors after the plane hit, broken in the bodies of the airline passengers whose last life image was that of the building's walls looming ahead. They did a remarkable, I mean, to me, it was, in retrospect, it took me a while to understand this and process this. What they did at the college that day is they organized the entire campus community, but they also helped organize the entire Jersey City community. And one of the things that Father Lochran made clear was that there was going to be controversial, there would be ugliness in addition to all the horror of the tragedy of the human loss, there was going to be recriminations against a religious group, for example, and people of other backgrounds were likely to come in the days to come. And he said, it's what we most represent and what we most stand for is that there will be in this community, there will be no hostility to people of other backgrounds and faiths. And he really made good on this promise. And so the terrible thing to hear people later saying that there are people dancing on buildings, it was just completely untrue. And it was a remarkable period of a few days. And I think St. Peter's College and the Jesuit community really played this enormous role. And so, needless to say, I began to reflect gradually on this process, because to me, I was a visiting faculty member, and lo and behold, what was I doing? I was teaching a course on the history of the Port of New York and New Jersey, and our first meeting was that day, and our first meeting was on the Jersey City waterfront, like we'd arranged in advance. Or maybe it was a second meeting in the first organizational class. We'd arranged in advance to meet down here at Liberty State Park on the Jersey City waterfront. But Ray had already been down there anyway, so Ray Schroth had already been there. For me, I was like basically staggering aimlessly towards the waterfront, where I feared that maybe a student or two who was in this later class that day that was going to do the class on the Port of New York and New Jersey, maybe there was a student or more students who were there waiting and wondering what happened. So I walked down there. Of course, there was nobody there. There were no class. Everything had been changed. But I really was not cognizant the way the Jesuits and others at St. Peter's College were they were prepared because part of their vocation was being prepared for the human experiences like these. And there was nothing like this. No one had ever experienced anything like this, but if you break it down into the small parts, they were accustomed to consoling people and to helping to organize peoples and to help the pastoral process, which of course obviously is extremely preliminary at that point with the thing still on fire. So anyway, what happened to me in the weeks to come, the rest of the time that I was at St. Peter's College that semester, we did teach the course. And one of the things that came out of it was a few things. One was I was determined in a very, very modest way. I wanted to make this project I was doing about the Port of New York and about the movie on the waterfront, I wanted to make it a very, very modest tribute to the people who had lost their lives and their families on 9/11. And so the man I was writing about was a Jesuit priest. His name was John Corridon, and he was a priest who in the 1940s and 50s helped to organize dock workers, mostly Irish-American dock workers in the Port of New York and New Jersey, in order to have them in solidarity for their rights and their dignity as human beings, their rights to organize, their rights to better working conditions, their rights to better pay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what I came to understand in doing the research was the Jesuits were deeply embedded historically in the New York waterfront. And so it was not an accident that this priest in the 1940s would become the leading advocate for the rights and the dignity of dock workers in the port. And of course, it turns out, as I began to reconstruct all this, it's really an incredibly rich Jesuit history in one small place. Now, admittedly, it's New York City, but still, it's a very small place. St. Peter's Prep, where my father, in fact, graduated in 1946, right on the river, literally right directly across from the side of the World Trade Center. St. Peter's College up the hill a little bit more, up Kennedy Boulevard. St. Peter's Labor School, which was a Jesuit program to teach the dock workers their rights as human beings and as workers on the Jersey City waterfront. Some of the Hoboken locations that maybe I get to later. Xavier Labor School on the other side. Another Jesuit prep school, Xavier High School in Chelsea, Manhattan neighborhood. And the Xavier Labor School, where this priest named Father John Corridon, who I wrote about, did his work on behalf of dock workers. See how closely together they're all linked. And then, very interestingly enough to me, the Port Authority headquarters on 14th Street and 8th Avenue, which is now, at least became a Google headquarters. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was the bi-state agency that was established in 1921 to sort of organize the commerce on both sides of the harbor in New York and New Jersey, a bi-state agency. That is an agency covering two states. And the idea was to try to rationalize competition and business and shipping and workplace conditions and the relationships of workers to management to make it more humane and just and decent. It's hard to believe when you're waiting in line at a toll of the George Washington Bridge or Holland Tunnel and you're saying, "Oh, that darn Port Authority." It was really created out of like the kind of this idealistic mode of trying to humanize really the very irrational, dangerous, violent, and often very oppressive conditions affecting work and other matters in the Port of New York, New Jersey, and New York Harbor. And so that's what they did. Now here's where it became such a revelation to me. The dominant figure in the history of the Port of New York and New Jersey was a man called Austin J. Tobin, who was a Brooklyn Irish Catholic whose grandfather was a dock worker who had lost his life in a workplace accident early in Austin Tobin's life. Austin Tobin went to Catholic schools in Brooklyn, and he went to Holy Cross College, the Jesuit college. Now here's where it gets interesting. At Holy Cross College, he lost his faith, right? He lost his faith. He decided he could no longer be a Catholic. He decided he no longer believed in the things he'd been taught growing up. But what he did instead was he became an attorney. He went to Fordham Law School. He became an attorney and went to work for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And it doesn't take a psychologist or a genius of any kind to begin to recognize in the work that Austin Tobin did at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which he ran for 30 years, he transferred the Catholic moral order that had kind of prevailed in his life and upbringing in the schools he went to and the churches he worshiped in. And he kind of, in a secular, non-religious way, he transferred all that energy and all that humane impulse to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which he directed for all these decades. He went to Fordham Law School. Fordham Law School, and that's interesting. I taught right next to Fordham Law School for 16 years on West 60th Street, Manhattan. But that's not where Fordham Law School was. When Austin J. Tobin went to Fordham Law School was in the Woolworth Building. It occupied 2 floors of the Woolworth Building on 27th and 28th Street in Manhattan. And as you can see, the Woolworth Building is the one with the green, see the one in the right foreground with the little green cap on it? That's the Woolworth Building. Right, and of course, this is a contemporary photograph, which is right at the heart, right exactly where the Twin Towers, where the World Trade Center was rebuilt. So in other words, the Woolworth Building was right on the Lower West Side, New York waterfront. And this is where he went to law school. So the Jesuits were so deeply, and the Jesuit tradition, he went to Holy Cross, Jesuit school, then he went to Fordham Law School, Jesuit school, right? He was kind of a surreptitious, or he was certainly an ally of the Jesuits. And he became the top secret main ally of these Jesuit labor priests who were trying to reform conditions in the port. He was their guy. And I was the first person to reveal this story in my book. And it was the kind of thing I probably might not even have figured it out, except that I'd by then achieved an understanding of how the Jesuits worked in the port. First of all, they work with all people of goodwill. In other words, I never heard of a single Jesuit say, that Austin Tobin, he would have been okay if he hadn't stopped being Catholic. You know what I mean? We couldn't really work with him. No, they were like, wait a second. He says he's not Catholic anymore. What does he do? He does the work of social justice, the work which they approved as essential, and a man with the power and authority to, in fact, do something about it. So all the reforms that were instituted in the Port of New York and New York Harbor in the 1940s and 50s were the result of Austin J. Tobin. And finally, before I switch a little bit here, Austin J. Tobin built the Twin Towers, right? He built the World Trade Center. Now, why did he do that? Well, one of the things the Port Authority had concluded during the time that he was the executive director at the agency in the 1940s and 50s, they couldn't get anything done because of the influence of organized crime and the relationship between organized crime and the political structures in Jersey City and in New York City. Impossible. They couldn't achieve anything. There was such tremendous resistance. It was all about money, of course. Tremendous resistance. And there was one thing that made it even more really, really touchy. The New York Archdiocese wasn't really that crazy about the Jesuit labor priests either, or the work the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was doing. So they even had a struggle within the church itself. But they continued to persist to do this work. And Austin J. Tobin basically said, I'm going to build these twin towers. This is how I want you to just envision this for a minute. And it sounds ridiculous, I know, but it's not, because every time I think about how crazy it might sound, I know more than ever how true it is. He basically envisioned the twin towers as the world's tallest piers, right? As vertical piers. Because the actual piers, the docks in New York and New Jersey, were controlled by organized crime figures. He said, we're going to build the world's enormous, longest, tallest piers, and we're only going to allow legitimate, respectable maritime and waterfront industries to be represented in the footage, the office space that we're going to create in the Twin Towers. And that's what he originally tried to do. Now, he didn't realize, if you think about the square footage of the two Twin Towers, it was more than all the docks ever built in the history of New York City combined. He couldn't fill all that. So eventually it came to be filled with financial industries and not related to maritime, activities. One thing you probably know, though, you remember from 9/11, the fallout, how many of the people who died and worked in the Twin Towers were related, a generational succession, related to dock workers and others who had grown up in Lower Manhattan and Hudson County, New Jersey, and who had been working class, who had worked so their children could go to college. And many of them ended up working in the firms like Cantor Fitzgerald and others, where so many people were killed. Do you remember in the aftermath of 9/11, there was such a strong response around the country? People said, wait a minute, we thought New York was this horrible place where people are nasty and mean to each other and everybody was cruel and ruthless. And there was this tremendous feeling of solidarity for months to follow 9/11. And part of it, a big part of it, in my view, was something instilled by the Jesuits and by the Port Authority, which was this communal social justice, humane understanding of what they were trying to achieve in the first place. And now, of course, that all apparently, seemingly had been lost, And so I spent the next 6 or 7 years writing this book called The Irish Waterfront. Now, of course, what happened in the meantime was, after all that had happened, we were still in our own family life, and I'll come back to this photo in a second. What we were still working with was the fact that our son Charlie still needed to be educated, and we were still committed to making sure that he had received the education that we felt very strongly he deserved, was entitled to. And so we began to. My son and I, we always loved to be together, We always loved doing things together. Now, it sounds like a cruel irony or something, but it's not. It's just a fact of life. I'm a pretty big talker. My son is a total non-talker, right? And so we love being together. We love doing things together. And when we moved to Central Jersey in 2001, 3 months before 9/11, a friend of mine in South Jersey, now deceased, gave me this bicycle, this old Raleigh road bike. How long ago this is, no helmet. I know I can't help it. Every time I see that, I say, so, geez, Jim, no helmet. But Charlie at least has one. But we started riding bikes in July and August of 2001 because we just loved being together. And so we just kept riding bikes. And, I was working at St. Peter's College, and then miraculously, I was hired by somebody that Dan Kosaki and Tim Dolly and others know well. A Jesuit named Mark Massa hired me at Fordham. And the next thing you know, I'm working at Fordham for the next 16 years. And first I was at Rose Hill, and then I needed to be closer to Jersey because I ran home every single day to ride bikes with my son, even all through the year, including the winter. And so they made that possible for me to do that. I went to Lincoln Center campus then from 2006 to 2018. And we just began riding bikes together. And we never stopped, And we've had over 7,000 bike rides. And we've ridden over 75,000 miles on our bikes together since 2001. And it's this one thing that's kept us together and kept us in motion and kept us going. And there's been this one great miracle of all things that no one would ever imagine could possibly be true. And that is, I've kept my big mouth shut in every one of those rides all those years because he doesn't talk anyway. So he doesn't need to hear me talking to him. And so we've had this nonverbal communication, which is a very powerful form of communication through all this time. Now, he really did struggle. And so he struggled in school. He struggled enormously. I wouldn't even get into the details of it because he's autistic. He's got like a very, very serious neurological disability. So here I was, having come through this kind of experience with 9/11, and for the first time, now I got to Jesuit college for 2 years and dropped out. I never gave it much thought. I suddenly began to understand there was something to this Jesuit thing. There really was. There was something legitimate about it. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie On the Waterfront. There's a great line where Marlon Brando, he plays a dock worker called Terry Malloy. He says, there's a lot more to this than I thought. I start to realize there's a lot more to this Jesuit thing than I thought. And so I will say, around 2004 and 5, when my son was really struggling, I said to my wife, I said, Christine, we should put on a conference. We should put on a conference at Fordham on autism as a social justice issue under the Jesuit auspices of the Center for American Catholic Studies, where I taught at Fordham. We should do something again that no one had ever done. I mean, these waterfront priests, they made this movie on the waterfront. They failed in the long run in their mission, but they certainly brought a lot of publicity to the plight of dock workers. And then, needless to say, the work Austin Tobin did to build the Twin Towers, they tried very, very hard to humanize the struggle of life in the poor New York and New Jersey. What if we could do something to humanize the struggle of people with autism and their families? So we put on this conference, and we planned it for a year, and lo and behold, we got 350 people there. Father McShane, the Jesuit, who was one of the former president who I saw earlier today, he introduced the conference, and it was under the auspices of Catholic Studies. Now, at the time, people would say, well, what in the world does this have to do with Catholic Studies? And my answer was, well, nothing per se, nothing directly, but if you think about it, it's this communal attempt to try to understand the experience of people with autism and their families and their education and their rights and their human dignity without any reference whatsoever to all what was already becoming these very divisive controversies over autism. Well, it's caused by this, or it's caused by that, or this is the technique you must pursue in order to help these children, or you must do this. We wanted no part of controversy or divisiveness or any of those things which would separate people from each other. We wanted a sense of what kind of communal response could we make? We had a rabbi. Sounds like I know an old religious joke. We had a rabbi, we had a priest, and we had a minister, right? And we had a lot of lay people. We had a lot of people with no religious background. And we had autistic speakers, which was almost unheard of in 2006, which when you think how crazy that is. Now, of course, somebody like my son could never do it because he doesn't speak, but there are plenty of people who with autism who will speak, who do speak. So we really covered the spectrum. It was a remarkable, and again, I'm not taking credit. You understand? Well, my wife deserves the credit. She did most of the organizing, but I am linking it to the Jesuit tradition in the New York Harbor, the Port of New York and New Jersey, and what I learned about Jesuit ministry, Jesuit social action. Remember, the whole thing with the Jesuits, the whole person. It's the whole person. It's not a little piece. It's not like, somebody got a needle in their arm and they became autistic. It's like, no, it's not like that at all. Nothing works like that, right? We know that. It's the whole person. It's the experience of the whole human being throughout their whole lifespan. These folks live, like everybody else does. What causes autism? Well, the only requirement is to be born a human being. Right? Okay? So we really did achieve that goal, and it never could have happened except for what I would call this Jesuit charism, this kind of thing that was sort of driving me. Now, just prior to this, because I thought we were kind of on a roll, and I was. I mean, things got tougher later. We were kind of on a roll in the early 2000s. After the 9/11 had passed a little bit. One day it dawned on me, I was writing a book about the movie On the Waterfront, which won 8 Academy Awards, and in 1954 it came out, and it's this great tribute to the Jesuit apostolate in the port. Well, lo and behold, the screenwriter who won the Academy Award, Bud Schulberg, he was still alive. He was still alive. He was 95 years old and living in Long Island, in Suffolk County, Long Island, on the beach. And I got in touch with him, and next thing you know, I said, Bud, how would you like to speak at Fordham some night? And he said, Jim, he said, I've wanted my whole life to thank the Jesuits for what they did for me to make this movie possible, to write this movie and get On the Waterfront made. Because he said the Jesuits made it possible for me to do this movie, the New York Jesuits. And I said, he said, Jim, no one's ever asked me. He said, no one's ever asked me to talk about it. He didn't just volunteer on his own. No one's ever, but I'm asking you, what a night that was. That was 350 people at McNally Amphitheater in New York City, at Fordham too, and it was an unforgettable night. I know I'm almost done because I want to take a couple minutes with the autism. Do you mind? All right, look, I am going to tell this story. Dan's been great. He's been authorizing me to tell these stories. I came to be really close friends with Bud and his wife Betsy and his son Ben and others in his family, and I drove him from Long Island that night, way out in Southampton Beach. I drove him to Manhattan. The Jesuits, I don't know if they still do, they had like this incredible perk of a parking lot on 9th Avenue. It's like the most valuable real estate in North America. And they had their own personal parking lot with a key and a gate. And I arranged for the first and only time in my life to get into that parking lot. It was right there on 9th Avenue. We got in there, I parked there. And then when it was over, I went to take Bud home and his wife Betsy, a long ride all the way out to Long Island. The only thing is, it had not occurred to me, having gotten in, I had to figure out a way to get out because they locked it behind us and there was nobody to let us out. And so we were there for 45, 50 minutes, and it got kind of embarrassing because they were quite elderly, and they need to get home. And I called on the intercom several times to Fordham Security, and they said, yeah, we can't really help you with that right now. And okay, so I might have possibly said the third time after an hour, I said, this is Father Joe McShane. I'm here with a very important guest of Fordham. Okay, and the next thing you know, we're on our way, and it was great. So I had Bud that night, and then we did the autism conference the next year, and it was an incredible. And to this day, and I'm really, it sounds like I'm bragging, but again, I was just riding this wave that I'd gotten on. And of course, you think about the terrible tragedy of the fact that all these thousands of people had died. That was something we never forgot. And of course, we want people to understand the experience of people with autism. So many people were suffering every day, and we want to avert further tragedies in the world. And we really did a strongly advocacy-oriented conference about the rights and dignity of people with autism. The problem then became, for my wife, Christina, and for Charlie especially, was that he was growing up, and now by 2006, he was 9, then he was 10. And as he approached his adolescent years, it just became extremely difficult. His human condition, being autistic, became extremely difficult for him, and we continued to ride our bike. In fact, we intensified our riding bikes because the fact is, after a certain point, about the only thing we could ever do anymore was ride bikes together. And of course, he needed to be in motion. Of course, it turns, you can see how ADHD and crazy I am. I need to be in motion too with him, and we were, and we just rode and rode and rode. But his struggles really intensified in school and other settings, and so all that I had come to understand about the Jesuits in terms of the communal quality of it, the persons for others, all I could do was focus really that on him. And it was a little bit it was sad for me because at Fordham, I left my job as co-director of the Center for Catholic Studies. I was able to get moved to Lincoln Center campus, which I needed, but I became increasingly limited and restricted in what I could do until finally I couldn't do anything other than teach my classes and then run home to ride bikes myself because that was the most important thing I could possibly do. And eventually it resulted in us moving to California, Northern California, and he is doing magnificently well. And I would normally be riding a bike with him right now on Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock California time. And his mom, my wife, Christina, is riding a bike. Because the one thing that was very, very important to us is somebody else has to know how to ride. He has to be able to ride a bike with somebody else. Just in case, in the unlikely event I'm not here forever, he might have to ride a bike. He's going to want to ride a bike with somebody else. Now he can ride a bike with anybody. So anyway, all that's been taken care of, and it's been an incredible experience. And I just want to share this as a tribute in my own very modest way, again, a very disorganized way, a tribute to what I came to understand in Jersey City. Here's that day in 2001. Here is Bud Schulberg on the left. This is in the Hoboken waterfront. Bud Schulberg on the left, the screenwriter. This is Father John Corridon, who was the Jesuit labor priest, who was portrayed by Carl Malden in the movie On the Waterfront. You should all see it if you haven't. He won 8 Academy Awards. And that's the great Elie Kazan, the director, on the right. And it was another world. And of course, it was another time when they made this movie in the 1950s. In the 1950s, there were so many Jesuits that when John Corridon entered the seminary, they said, well, there's too many Johns, so they decided we don't have too many Pete, so they called him Pete. From that time forward, he's known as Pete Corridon. It's not like that anymore. There's not a surplus of Jesuits anymore, as far as I understand. And so the Jesuits have come to turn over their mission to people like the rest of us. And I came to believe that, yeah, even though the idea of an autism conference didn't seem to make that much sense from the perspective of Catholic studies, of course it really does, because families, like the families of people who work at Jesuit schools, including many at Fordham, including many other faculty colleagues, it turns out, had autistic children, and it all made perfect sense. And we were able to do this in the spirit of, in the tradition of, this trio, especially Bud Schulberg, who really was amazing, wonderful man, who was so helpful to me. And then the book came out in 2009 on the Irish waterfront. And of course, what I loved about the cover, and this is what I worked to have this, to make sure this was achieved, was it's both sides of the river. This is Hoboken and Jersey City, and that's, of course, the west side of Manhattan. It's both sides of the river because the Port Authority, the whole idea, and the Jesuit model from that map I showed you originally of all the Jesuit sites on both sides of the river, the point of it was you don't separate by political jurisdiction. You want to create a unified environment in the harbor so that things work efficiently and with justice for all and concerned, right? And so these two sides of the river were bitterly at odds with you. They still are. I mean, they had gun battles. In the 1800s, there were gun battles in the middle of the Hudson River between police from Jersey and New York City over jurisdiction. Of course, typical of New York City claimed jurisdiction over Jersey side to the high tide mark on the Jersey Shore. You know what I mean? Like said, this part of the shore is ours. You know what I mean? Or low tide. You know, when the tide goes out. So. And this is all, I've written a few books. This is the only one I really think achieved anything because, or the most successful, because it was linked. And then, of course, what had happened in the meantime, the people at St. Peter's College began to ask me to reflect on my experience, both at 9/11, which I did for some of their publications, and also, of course, writing this book. Because what was absolutely astounding to me during the 6 months after 9/11, when I really got a chance to get to know people at St. Peter's College, was how many people at the college had grown up with figures who were portrayed in the movie on the waterfront. It's all based on real life people, both gangsters and saints and dock workers and their families and others. And one after another, I met these folks from Jersey City and from Bayonne and from Weehawken. They'd all grown up there on the waterfront, and they all knew the people who were portrayed in the film. And it was just incredible to understand how deeply realistic and embedded in the actual human experience of this port of New York and New Jersey, and that it really was tied together by the Jesuits. Like, I can't even imagine, I can't visualize, I can't even contemplate what any of this would have been like without the Jesuit presence. And the Jesuit presence is what linked all these neighborhoods and communities and forces together. That's why they had a prep school in Brooklyn Prep. That's why they had a prep school in Hudson County, St. Peter's Prep. That's why they had a prep school in Chelsea, Xavier High School. That's why they had a high school. Then they had the real fancy one, Regis, uptown. And then they had Loyola, also uptown. And of course, Fordham Prep. So 6 Jesuit high schools that were if you put in a circumference or whatever radius, I don't know what it is, within about 8 or 10 miles of each other total, 6 Jesuit high schools in one area, And so they transformed the community. And after 9/11, I'll just say, as I sort of wrap this up, I just got to say, if you ever get a chance, if you ever read any stories about 9/11, unbelievably powerful emotional stories came out of places like Xavier High School and particularly I want to start with Xavier High School on West 16th Street in Chelsea. Now the parish is still there. This is the parish where the labor priest lived. Dozens of folks connected to Xavier High School were killed on 9/11. And the way that the school came together in response became like one of the models of the way you began to see people throughout what I call the Port Authority region come together and respond. And I want to also close by saying that this Jesuit, Ray Schroth, he was a controversial guy, like a lot of Jesuits. He was a little bit controversial. He was a strong personality. And he mentored an untold number of young journalists and young writers. And that was the thing of which I think he was most proud. And he mentored people who won Pulitzer Prizes and begin to name others, one of whom, which maybe the best known of whom, was a man named Jim Dwyer, the late Jim Dwyer, who was a student at Fordham when Ray taught there. and who went later worked for newspapers, including the New York Times, and who won the Pulitzer Prize for work he did on covering 9/11. And in covering 9/11, in his book, if anybody has, I can't believe I forgot because I just erased it. Anyway, if you want to look on Amazon or Jim Dwyer, he has a book. It's called like 102 Minutes, I think it's called, that he won, and it was based on the reporting he'd done in the Times. It's unbelievably powerful. What Jim Dwyer did in his writing on the Times, who was a protege of Ray Schroeth, this Jesuit, who was totally inspired by Ray originally, he embodied and brought together not only what happened to these people on 9/11, but who they had been and what they became. And if anybody remembers, and I'll never forget, the Times, for weeks and weeks and weeks, the New York Times did this feature every single day called Portraits in Grief. And they did these capsule summaries of the lives of all the men and women who were killed in 9/11. And Jim Dwyer was one of the impetus of that and wrote many of these entries. And one of the entries that he wrote was about a man named Frank DeMartini. And Frank DeMartini was one of the heroes at 9/11, a man who'd been hired by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey after 9/11, after the first attack. Remember in 1993? It was attacked in 1993. It was bombed from underground in 1993. And 6 or 7 people were killed, and it was considered an unbelievable disaster. Think about it, the difference, the death, but still, that was a terrible tragedy. Frank DeMartini was a construction guy who was hired to manage the reconstruction of the Twin Towers so that this could never happen again. And Jim Dwyer, much of the book is about him, and much of this New York Times reporting he did treated Frank. Well, it just so happens that on August 21st, 2001, 3 weeks before, or 2 weeks before 9/11, 3 weeks before 9/11, I found myself in the offices of Frank DeMartini at the Port Authority because a friend of mine named Angus Gillespie had written the history of the Twin Towers. A friend, a guy named Roy knows. A man at Rutgers named Angus Gillespie had written a history of the Twin Towers. He wrote the first history of the Twin Towers, the history of the building of the Twin Towers. It came out in 1999 or 2000. It sold a grand total of 800 copies in its first 2 years of existence. And then, of course, needless to say, by September 12th, 2001, it was the #1 best-selling book in the country. And it sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and Angus donated much of it to fund Port Authority families. Anyway, Angus got me this interview with Frank DeMartini, who was the man who rebuilt the Twin Towers after the 1993 bombing. And he gave us the tour of all the sub-basements. I won't get into it, but all the way it was built originally. The upside-down bathtub, the slurry walls. Because remember, it's built on landfill. The Twin Towers was built on landfill. It was built in the mud. That wasn't real land before they built it, or before the neighborhood around it was built in the 19th century. It was not land, solid. It was landfill. And so all that was involved in building it. And of course, his office is on the 88th floor of the North Tower. Well, no one ever thought about, what about an airplane, So anyway, Frank gave us this unbelievably beautiful tour. And it was just like, in retrospect, it occurred to me later, it was just like having a tour from Austin Tobin, Now, Austin Tobin built the Twin Towers, and they opened in 1974. We all saw it built. Those of us who grew up in Jersey, we saw it built. It opened around 1974, and it was his baby. Like, it was this monumental achievement. And they opened it, and they dedicated it, and they dedicated the plaza, which became known as Austin J. Tobin Plaza. And the whole idea was this was a tribute to Austin Tobin. And when they had the dedication ceremony, it was all set up for him to come take a bow and to be acknowledged for all he'd done to get this project built. Tobin was alive, but he didn't show up for the dedication. He didn't show up. They said, what in the world happened? He said, I thought it might rain that day. I didn't want to go. Well, he was heartbroken. Like, he had basically been destroyed. He had been destroyed in the process of building. Can you imagine? Look, people in New York City, they try to get like a variant. They try to get like some kind of like variance to build, like to add a screen door to their apartment. I mean, this is a guy building the world's largest office complex over 20 years of struggle with every powerful construction union and figure and Rockefeller and political figure and money figure. And so it totally broke him, but he did get it built. So anyway, Frank DeMartini was he's a very upbeat guy. he was a very buoyant guy, and he just reminded me of thinking. It was almost like he had that same spirit. Like he loved where he worked and what he did and the people he worked with. And he took me to the top. We went to the top floor of the empire of his office, and he showed us. They even had artists. You know, they had artist studios in unused office space on the very top of the World Trade Center. You remember the guy Philippe Petit who walked across the Twin Towers in August of '74? Right? He used those studios to sort of cross from one building to the other. Anyway, so Frank took me up there, and I said, you know, Frank, this is unbelievably helpful to me because I'm teaching a course on the history of the port of New York and New Jersey at St. Peter's College starting in 2 weeks. He said, what, say that again? You're teaching a course? And it's not like a class, you mean, like a seminar for the whole semester on the history of the port of New York and New Jersey. He said, I can't even imagine. Like, what would that be? I said, well, Frank, it's like what you do. It's based on what you do. And like the work you've done is like the sort of the heart and soul of it. And then I remember we were in his office, and he looked out and he said, well, okay, so you really know this whole harbor really well. He said, he pointed across the river to a huge school building in Jersey City. And he said, you know, every day I drive through the tunnel, I always wonder, because he was from Camden, but he lived in Brooklyn, but he's from Camden originally. He said, he had that great South Jersey accent. He said, every day I drive through the tunnel, and I see this enormous building. I wonder what it is. I said, oh, Frank, that's Dickinson High School, which was like sort of like the classical sort of public high school built in Jersey City in the early 20th century. And I remember saying, whether I said to him or not, I thought to myself, it's one of the few non-Jesuit, you know what I mean? Of all the things he could pick out, this is one of the few non-Jesuit sort of, because it was so monumental. The Jesuit presences were always more modest physically, but spiritually and emotionally, they were so powerful. And he really represented to me the embodiment of that kind of spirit. I don't know what religion he was. I don't know anything about it. But as far as like representing that spirit, the love of the port, the people in it, like Austin J. Tobin and like these labor, and like Ray Schroth, who, remember, inspired the journalist who did the most important writing in the history of the story of the port. And he really clearly inspired me in a more modest way. He totally inspired me to do what I did. So that's my tribute to the Jesuits, to be here today with you to share, and I'm really grateful for the chance. So thank you, and let me know if you have any questions or comments at this point. I know we went over, Dan. I know Dan was like, you know I'd go over, but if you have any, does anybody have any questions? We could just talk informally. Where are you from? Are you from Springfield? Yeah, where'd you go to high school? Oh, in Springfield, very good, yeah. Yeah, exactly, sure, I've been there, man. We lived in Cranford for 11 years, and as you know, a lot of people in Union County originally come from Jersey City and Bayonne, Hudson County, or from New York, but it's a great place to live, yeah, wow, very good. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. He did, and in a way, maybe it was inevitable because he was these are all rough characters. A lot of these guys. Corden was a tough guy. Ray was in the military. He's a tough guy. Ray Schroth's father, mentioned, was the editor of the Brooklyn. His father was the editor of the Trenton Times. His uncle was the editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which is a famous newspaper in Brooklyn. And he was a tough working journalist and a Jesuit. And anyway, Corden was like that. He was a tough-minded guy whose father was a cop who died young on the job. And they were determined to get reforms for the dock workers. And one of the things they discovered, and this is treated in the movie On the Waterfront, implicitly, a little subtly, that was the Catholic Church, particularly the New York Archdiocese, appeared to be, they had a relationship with the waterfront entrepreneurs, right? There's a guy in the movie, he's known as Mr. Big of the waterfront. He was a real guy named Bill McCormick. He was a very powerful donor to the New York Archdiocese. So in other words, the Archdiocese had this classic pickle, which is, we've got this guy who gives us millions and we don't interfere with what he does in his work life, which involves crushing dock workers' unions and things like that. We don't get involved in that. That's his business. We were very grateful for the magnificence of his charity to the church, right? And Cardinal Spellman, of course, Francis Cardinal Spellman was the most powerful Catholic in America. And he was willing to play ball, to say, with Mr. Big, they called him. And so, yeah, there was that whole issue. And it did drive Corden crazy. It aggravated or agitated Father Corden quite a bit. And that's why, needless to say, to get this movie done, he did something which was considered very insurrectionary at the time. He turned to completely non-Catholic sources, Bud Schulberg was Jewish. He'd been a communist. Elia Kazan. Now, Elia Kazan had actually gone to Catholic school. He wasn't Catholic. He was Greek Orthodox. And he had it in for the church even more. Bud loved the Jesuits. Kazan was totally suspicious the whole time. He made the movie. He was completely suspicious of the Jesuit influence. He said, I think this is something fishy about this. You know what I mean? Like, why would they be so sympathetic to the workers if they represent the church? People didn't understand that. That's why they often said Corydon was among the first, the so-called liberation theologians, because he basically, and I want to say, in terms of the inclusiveness of the Jesuit apostolate 60, 70, 80 years ago in the Port of New York, they made a very simple point, which is, before you can ask people to act like Catholics, they have to be able to live like human beings. So first, you achieve their rights, you establish their rights to live in dignity as human beings, and then you can really get into the other material about the theology and the church and all that. But first, you have to be able to live in dignity as human beings. And that's actually the spirit we took to the Autism Conference, too, because it was terrible as recently as 20 years ago, and probably as recently as today, unfortunately. There is a tremendous amount of injustice towards the intellectually disabled, and it's just a fact, and it's just a terrible, tragic fact of life. It's not like people are consciously saying we want to torment the intellectually disabled, but we just have never achieved the level of justice for the intellectually disabled. Most likely because there's a feeling that, well, they're not really the most productive citizens. And so it's a terrible ordeal that people continue to struggle with. So anyway, yeah, so that was, but and so what happened, the fascinating thing I got to say, and the hero of the story, in fact, who I'd never mentioned at all, was the Jesuit provincial, that is the superior officer of the New York Jesuit province. His name was John McMahon. He always stood up for Corydon whenever he antagonized the Archbishop or others, and he always said, no, I'm not going to throw him out. I'm not going to send him away. But finally, I won't get into the story. See the movie. At the very end, things start to go awry. They did ship him out. They shipped Father Corydon to Lemoyne College. Anybody have another Jesuit school in Syracuse, right? Lemoyne College. They put him on a train. They set him up there, and they said, it was a little rough. They said to him, there was a new provincial, by the way. It makes all the difference in the world. He had a new boss. The old boss had left, and the new boss said, well, you spent all this time talking about the economics of the waterfront and the labor unions. You seem to be quite an expert on economics. So he said, I've decided the best thing for you to do is to become professor of economics at Lemoyne College in Syracuse. And he said, classes start in 2 weeks. They're looking forward to your arrival. They'll see you later today. And he got on the train in Grand Central Station. And when the train arrived at Syracuse and the Jesuits from Lemoyne were there to greet him, he wasn't on the train. He jumped off. He lived. He didn't kill. He jumped off the train and fled. And so it began a long process of discernment on his part, what he wanted to do for the rest of his career. And you know what he ended up doing? He ended up teaching theology at St. Peter's College in Jersey City for the last decade or so of his life. It's an amazing story. And of course, Dan and others will know too, where does he die? Where does he go? Like all the great Jesuits, the Jesuit residence in Fordham, Murray Whitehall, Jesuit at Fordham in the Rose Hill campus in the Bronx. And it's he died in 1984. It's a very powerful story, very moving. And Bud Schulberg, he lived to be close to 100. And I was with him the last couple of times. I was with Bud for his last public appearance. And Bud, he always had a stutter, but by the end, he also had a very hard time hearing and communicating. So it almost reminded me of working with anybody, because everybody becomes disabled eventually. And Bud had this disability that he was born with, and then it got aggravated by age and hearing loss. And so I was basically, poor God bless Bud, I was actually translating his answers to questions at a big event we did at the Museum of the City of New York. It was just unforgettable, And then when Bud died, for his 100th anniversary, they had a conference at Dartmouth. I was lucky to speak, and his family was there at Dartmouth College in 2014, and we got to stay friendly with his family, and it's one of the great gifts. And he really was. People always say, "Oh, Bud become a Catholic." Is he going to become a Catholic because he was so inspired by these Jesuits? And there was a father. I don't know if you knew Father George Hunt, for example. He was very friendly with Bud, and he used to always say, "Yeah, we just talked about maybe Bud will become a Catholic." But anyway, so any other? Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody. Please see the movie On the Waterfront. It's practically on YouTube at this point. It's totally readily available. If you ever see the Criterion Collection, there's a Criterion Collection edition, 3 discs. It's magnificent. It's the ultimate collection. And they gave me 30 minutes to tell my stories on the Criterion Collection. I can't recommend it highly enough. The Criterion Collection. they interviewed me for 2 hours. Have you ever seen the thing on YouTube? They have that Criterion closet. People go in there and they pick the movies. They even brought me in there and gave me a movie. It was great. They gave me a movie, 12 Angry Men. They gave me the copy of 12 Angry Men, the movie, Henry Fonda. But anyway, so if you get a chance, please see the movie. And, Scranton, of course, Tim and others have already described to me, Scranton has played a similar role, and I'm sure history of Scranton University of Scranton, and the political culture of this area, Scranton has, I know it's a newer university, but I know it's played a role in some of these issues, and trying to represent a kind of a Jesuit social justice perspective. So any other, I don't have time to go. Anybody ever want to ask anything about? Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Right. That's one thing I was not good at. So my son and I, we've ridden 75,000 miles on our bikes. I just want to say, I want to brag for him. It's a team. It's all teamwork, and so I'm just so proud of him. It all worked out, and we were always influenced and the Jesuits were very compassionate to Charlie and to our situation. And let's face it, I had to run away from the campus, and it kind of broke me down a few times, more than a few times. It felt a little more too much so I could handle, Oh, yeah, I've been run over 3 times. But Charlie has incredible instincts. Thank God, But we've had it's quite a story. All right. So thanks again. Thanks for having me. Thanks.